Hi, so welcome back to the Mind of the Writer. Today we're going to be talking about narcissism and is the fiction writer narcissistic when they're writing, or are they anything but narcissistic? Before we get started, I highly recommend you watch the video called The Dynamic Duo, which quickly outlines two mantras which are going to follow us through this entire exploration of the psychology of writing. And the other video is the graphic video that I posted last week about the two approaches to writing fiction, because my arguments today are going to rely somewhat on, on the information in those two videos. So narcissism is a pretty hot topic right now, and it has many different facets to it. There are many different behaviors and traits that are associated with narcissism. So I decided to focus on 4 of those traits. The first being the narcissist as seeing themselves as a prophet or as godlike. The second one being the narcissist's tendency to love bomb the people in their lives, or at least people in the beginning of the relationships, so that they can get them under their spell before they start their major manipulations. The third one is the narcissist seeing people in their lives as extensions of themselves, particularly when it comes to their children. And the fourth one, probably the most important one, is the narcissist lacking empathy. So let's look at the fiction writer and how the fiction writer might exhibit some of these qualities and tendencies and traits when they're writing a story. So I want you to think about that first dynamic in the 2 approaches that I took last week. The author being in control of the story as opposed to the story being in control of the author. Because in that first approach, the author is the one in control. In that video, I really did present the author as the one at the top of the chain. The author is playing God. The author is the puppeteer that's manipulating all of the characters, pulling all of the strings, and deciding everything for the story and for the end result of the story. If we look at the fiction writer from that approach, we can definitely say that yes, the fiction writer from that angle is playing God. The fiction writer is the one in control, deciding everything, moving the characters around like chess pieces. If the narrator is omniscient, then the narrator is also slightly narcissistic, because the narrator understands, or at least is knowing what's happening in the characters' minds. But even so, the writer himself, herself, themselves will know what's happening in the characters' heads and will be in control of that. So in that dynamic, the writer is a godlike figure. If you take into consideration the advice in the dynamic duo video that I described, where the writing mentor explained that it's a writer's job to give the character all kind of wonderful qualities and make the reader love the character so that the reader feels that character's demise, then the writer in that first approach, the writer in control, what's the writer going to do? Well, the writer is going to give the character all sorts of wonderful qualities. And by wonderful, I don't necessarily mean virtuous, but intriguing, enigmatic, mysterious, but wonderful, wonderful qualities, so that the reader is going to have a vested interest in the outcome of that character. So essentially, the author is going to love bomb the character, but to the end that they're going to manipulate that character and make the reader feel that character's demise. Characters, when they are coming from the author, when the author is the source of those characters, the characters are an extension of the author. They are the author's ambassadors. And in this way, the characters really do line up or parallel the people in the narcissist's life in the off-page world, because the author is manipulating these entities to essentially do what they want them to do. And definitely the characters are an extension of the author. And then finally, if we go back to that renowned editor and that, mentor's advice that the author has to make the reader love the characters, and then the author has to kill those characters. The author has to have a lack of empathy for the characters that they've created. And in this way, I would say that the author is exhibiting very narcissistic tendencies. They're playing God. They're seeing those characters as an extension of themselves. They're love bombing them with all kinds of wonderful and intriguing characteristics and personality traits so that the reader will feel their deaths or their demise. And then finally, in order to lead the characters to their demise, the author has to be ruthless and the author has to lack empathy. So in that way, the author is definitely exhibiting narcissistic behavior. However, because part of my process is to argue the other side, I want you now to think of that other approach to fiction writing, where the author isn't necessarily the one in control, but the author is in the zone, they're in the present moment, they're in the now, and the story is coming to them. The characters are coming to them. In that dynamic, narcissism just fades away because the author isn't in control. The characters are. The author isn't God. The story is. And so in that dynamic, narcissism just can't possibly exist. And if you think that when those characters come to the author, they still need the author's emotion in order to come to life on the page and in order to reach the reader, in order to evoke emotion in the reader. So if you think of this, in order for the author to give the characters emotion, to pump them full of emotion, powerful enough to reach the reader and powerful enough to have some longevity in when it comes to readership, well, that author has to dig down into the most, the deepest, darkest, most vulnerable places in themselves in order to tap into that emotion and then flood it into the characters. So, I will say as a writer, I will give the characters, all my love, all my joy, all my pain, all my sadness, all my lust, all my passion, everything. And I have to dig so deep into my own experiences to get all the emotion that those experiences generated and then pass that, let's say, raw material or that raw energy to the characters. Well, that's not narcissism. That is the absolute opposite of narcissism. You really are, as an author, bearing your soul. And you're so vulnerable when you do that it's the furthest thing from narcissism. So in the second dynamic, or in the second approach, of the reader receiving the story and being open to the characters coming through them, but needing the human emotion as they pass through onto the page, into the story, then the author is anything but a narcissist. So there you've got my two views on whether a writer is a narcissist. I think that from the first approach, when the author is in control of the story, or if you view the author as being in control of the story, then definitely the author demonstrates some narcissistic behavior. But if you look at the story as coming to the author, then absolutely not. The author is really at the whim of the story and has to give so much of themselves that they could never be labeled a narcissist. So we'll see you next week on The Mind of the Writer.